Our very first panel is going to look at the issues of civil-military relations in the United States. And we're going to take about the next hour in first part to have a conversation among our distinguished panelists up here, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then preserve about the last 20 minutes or so of that for your questions. This is an area I think all of you here are keenly interested in. It plays into our follow-on panel directly on the future of the All-Volunteer Force, and I think will also be the subject in many ways of General Dempsey's remarks here at the lunch hour today. So very important topic, and one that's on the minds of all of us, particularly as we come out of combat operations that have lasted over 13 years with a force that in some ways was not designed for that. So let me introduce first our panelists here this morning. To my immediate left is the Undersecretary of the Army, Brad Carson, who was kind enough to fly in last night from a week-long trip to the Far East, coming in from Alaska at about 10 o'clock last night to join us today. So I've ensured he's well caffeinated and he's prepared to answer questions, but we owe him a special debt of gratitude for being here this morning. Mr. Carson is the 31st Undersecretary of the Army, and he's also the Army's Chief Management Officer in that capacity. Prior to that, he served for 2 years as the Army General Counsel. In a number of years back, he was also a two-term congressman from the 2nd District of Oklahoma, representing the Oklahomans on the Hill for several years, bringing that experience on the Hill to this debate here today as well. He also is, in another capacity, was a U.S. naval officer deployed with an Army explosive ordnance disposal unit to Iraq, so brings some in the field, boots on the ground experience that's both useful in his current job and will be very instructive to connect the ideas from the Hill, the ideas from the Pentagon, the ideas from the field here today. So we're delighted to have him join us this morning. To his immediate left, Dr. Janine Davidson, who's currently a Senior Fellow in Defense Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Janine's areas of expertise include defense strategy, policy, and civ-mil relations. Prior to her going to CFR, she spent several years in the Pentagon as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Plans, and also before that working in the Stability Operations Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Counterterrorism. She has previous military experience as well, spent a number of years in the United States Air Force as a command pilot, both flying C-130s and C-17. So again, brings an interesting perspective into this issue of civ-mil relations, both from her time in the Pentagon, her time now in think tank world, and her previous time in the Air Force. Finally, to my far left, truly a distinguished scholar in the field of civil-military relations, who will be well known to all of you, Dr. Richard Kohn, currently Professor Emeritus of History and Chair of the Curriculum in Peace, War, and Defense at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Flew up here this morning, again, a stalwart. Being in here, getting up, I think, I don't even know what time it was to make it up here on an airplane. So we're delighted to have him here. He has written and studied and researched and spoken through an entire career on the topic of civil-military relations, and editor of numerous books and publications, notable ones, Soldiers and Civilians, A Civil-Military Gap in American National Security. So again, we're delighted to have all three of these panelists here today, and I'll be moderating really a conversation up here this morning on the topic at hand. So let me begin by turning to the panelists to talk a bit about what their biggest concerns are with the status of civil-military relations in the United States. There are a number of pundits out there, you've all read them, that suggest that we're at a low point in civil-military relations here in the nation today. There's a number of headlines that might suggest that. We're coming out of 13 years of war with a force that was not terribly well designed for that, and a force that in some ways arguably views the results of the last 13 years as topics and outcomes that should be blamed on the civilian leadership. I've got two sons, they're military officers. As I talk to their peers and I talk to others out there in uniform, there's a clear view among many in the military, not all, that the military did its job well, and the real losses out there that occurred, the strategic setbacks, were the result of the civilian leadership. So a bit of a concern there. We also see a number of calls here recently as we're in current events with trying to determine what to do in the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq, on what role the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the chiefs of the services should play in advising the president, whether that should be public or private. Even some calls that the chairman or others should resign if their advice is not taken by the president. Another dynamic on the civil-military issues of concern. Just last summer, about a year and a half ago, summer before last, we had a senior retired military flag officer purporting to speak for the active duty military and opposing the president's policy decisions moving forward at that time on Syria. Fairly unusual dynamic that we haven't seen much evidence of, that again casts a different picture on the state of civil-military relations. So given that and many other concerns that we see in the headlines out there, turning to our panelists, what are your biggest concerns as we look ahead? We're now coming out of these wars, at least major combat operations. What's next for us in this field, and what's the state of health of this today? Dick, let me turn to you first.
Well, first I would say I don't think it's a low point when one goes back to the early Clinton administration and, of course, the Kennedy and Johnson administration. It's not a low point in civil-military relations, but my biggest concern is the continuing lack of understanding at the top of the government amongst the civilians about military culture, needs, processes, etc., for which I've never been able to figure out a solution because the civilian leadership is elected and appointed for different reasons than understanding the military generally. But also on the military side, a weakening of professionalism in the last 20 years. The idea that you can resign at the top level in the four-star ranks and create a civil-military crisis if you disagree, or even worse, if something immoral goes on, and also issues of strategic simplicity and understanding of what the civilians are about. And I think General Dempsey's tried to rectify that with his initiatives on professionalism and also on his worries about civil-military relations, an effort to inject it into the professional military education system.
All right, Janine?
Well, he took my first one. But no, I actually am not quite sure this is a low point across the spectrum. There are so many types of civil-military
lots of competition
relations.
for that
yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
But I mean, when you think about Vietnam, when you think about the way the American public felt about the military in previous eras, I think we're doing well on that score. I think we have trouble in other areas. I'm very much concerned about the sort of gap between civilians and military at the high levels in decision making. So when you have civilians who, not just that they haven't served, but you know, that they also haven't been, you know, taking Dick's classes on warfare, and you know, we aren't teaching these kinds of things in our universities anymore. And so you have a generation of civilian leaders that, you know, don't necessarily, you know about things like deterrence theory and not just military culture, but things like that. And so you get into this decision-making crisis where the civilians and the military are really talking past each other in terms of what it takes to use force to solve problems. And I think that's a really dangerous position to be in, and I think we saw and are seeing a lot of that play out when we're trying to find options for things like Syria, where we look back on Iraq and Afghanistan and we try to figure out whose fault it was. Well, there's fault on both sides. The other thing that concerns me is this growing separateness between the civilians and the military. And I worry about, and I don't know if we're there yet, a sense of elitism among people who are serving. And when it becomes clear that something like, and I've heard 17%, I've heard, I think, and I've heard 27% of Americans are even qualified to serve, to have the opportunity to serve, whether it's from grades or behavioral issues or most likely physical issues, and their educational system is so different that there's a sense that they're so separate from American society that they're better than regular Americans. And I think that could potentially be very dangerous for our society, when you have the people that are tasked to protect us having a sense that they're elite compared to the rest of society. I don't know if we're there yet, but I have definitely seen some evidence that some people feel that way.
And I think we'll talk to that as we go through this today, because there's an argument on both sides of that, clearly. Mr. Secretary, you live in this world. You're in the environment where every day you talk to senior uniformed military leaders. You hear their advice from the Chief of Staff of the Army and from the Vice Chief of Staff, and you can certainly see, you know, the folks that work for you and around you and those above you in the Defense Department on the civilian side, you know, perhaps having some of the same issues that Janine has brought up in terms of background and knowledge. What's your thoughts on where we stand as a nation right now?
Well, I guess I worry about us worrying, which is that, I mean, I think it is a crisis, and you know, Professor Kohn has written so much about this. He's authoritative on the question of normative civil-military relations. And the first thing I did when I became General Counsel of the Army was invite Professor Kohn to come speak to the Army staff, civilians, about this very issue, because it's an interesting one. And what he's written is powerful, and one can barely add to it. I guess the question being, why do we care about this matter? I guess there are two reasons that would offer themselves. One is something Janine mentioned, kind of the democratic danger of this, right, that the military is separate from the mainstream of society. And Professor Kohn has the data to show this, that without a question, the officer corps is more socially conservative, politically conservative, more likely to identify with the Republican Party than the country is at large. That doesn't bother me too much, however. In the sense of the democratic danger, do I think the Army G3 is plotting a putsch or something like this, right, or a coup d'etat? I don't see it in any way, shape, or form, right? In fact, the people who are most wedded to the idea of civilian control of the military is, in my experience, the senior Army leaders who believe in it passionately, who acknowledge it, and who understand it better, perhaps, than the civilians they work with. I suppose there's a second danger, which is it could affect military readiness, right? If the troops are so distinct from the society at large, right, that it inhibits their effectiveness in some way. But I don't see that either. I mean, it is true, as Janine also mentioned, that the people who serve in the military today are, relative to society at large, smarter, in better physical condition. I mean, that is because we select a subset of the population who can do it. So this doesn't bother me really either. So I think the challenge is, and it's one perhaps that, to come back to what Professor Kohn mentioned, is do we have civilian leaders worthy of the military leadership? You know, the military leaders have spent decades studying these issues. They are technically competent. They have a bias for action. They are people who thrive on execution, who will work from 5 a.m. till 10 p.m. 7 days a week to get the job done. That is a formidable group to work with if you come in as a civilian to work alongside with or to have some kind of leadership over. And to me, that is the major problem I see, is that right, the civilian leaders, and we are very lucky in the U.S. Army to have John McHugh, we are lucky to have Secretary Hagel, but it is not an easy job to compete with an institution that turns out routinely at the top level people who are so supremely competent in the work they do.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because that's going to be a hallmark of, I think, our society, our relations in the military with civilian leadership going forward. We can all remember, at least most of us that are my age or thereabouts can remember when Congress was comprised by disproportionately large numbers of veterans, first the World War II generation, then Korea, then Vietnam. That's no longer the case today. We know that the leaders on the Hill are decreasingly exposed to the military and didn't have that as part of their life growing up, part of the aspect of having an all-volunteer force, clearly. And we see the same thing as we look at the civilian political appointees in the Pentagon who are charged with the day-to-day responsibility of overseeing the military. The military studies this. This is their lane. These are the surgeons in the medical profession. And the people that are in running the HMO or the hospital may not be that steeped in the details of medicine, but still have that responsibility in a sense. So as we look ahead, what's the solution? How do we improve that? Dick?
Well, I agree with Mr. Carson that the military is supremely competent in the nitty-gritty of the military world, but you know, in operations and in tactics and in planning, but there's considerable evidence that there are some gaps there. In the development of weapons, in strategic understanding for the kinds of wars we've been involved in. And I wonder, I have kind of personal knowledge of this, they're not so knowledgeable about civil-military relations. And so, you know, I have to kind of ask, how well and how competent are they and how well do they do in subtly mentoring the civilian leadership to do its responsibility Because if the civilian leadership doesn't provide the political cover and the direction and the decision making and the policies, you leave the, not you, but the military is left adrift in a sense. And so I think we have to step back and take a look at the overall competency, particularly of the senior leadership of the U.S. military. It's different by service too, in terms of its culture and its orientation and its willingness to grapple with these issues. So I think that's, if the idea, and I'll just take one example here, if the idea, and I think it is abroad, at least in the middle ranks, the field grades of the military, that the senior-most leadership should in effect threaten implicitly to resign over any sort of very narrow, but some kind of problems that they disagree with, or a decision that's wrong, or it's an immoral one, or that a policy that they just can't abide. I mean, that's a true, in my judgment, a true flaw of professionalism. Certainly for civilian control, certainly for the kind of trust that's necessary for civil-military cooperation and effective decision-making. And so I think, you know, I'm kind of channeling, I don't want to put this on General Dempsey, but General Dempsey, when he came in as the TRADOC commander, wanted a review of military professionalism. And these kinds of issues that you mentioned at the very beginning, General Barno, are part of that.
These are, in effect, the responsibilities of the U.S. military that's a bit different than maybe some others in the world. This is a military that's always been drawn from the citizenry. This is one of the times that we now have a little bit of a different relationship there in terms of how many people in the military serve. But let's go back into that topic a little bit in terms of, you know, Janine, I would ask you, because you also served as a senior civilian in the Defense Department. You dealt with uniformed military people on a regular basis. Is the critique that there is a tremendous disconnect there in terms of skills and abilities and knowledge going to be something that we're going to have to come up with some type of a fix for over the future?
Well, I think that to say that there's a gap in skills, ability, and knowledge is a subjective thing. Because one of the things that I worry about is this disconnect between, you know, what the military thinks is its role, you know, and it's a very technically focused, you know, approach to warfare versus what it continually has been asked to do. And so, you know, I would ask, you know, they're incredibly competent at certain types of warfare, but, you know, especially since the Vietnam War, there's been a very concerted effort, I think, by the military to very tightly scope the type of thing that they think is their job, right? It's, you know, to fight and win the nation's wars, and wars look like this, they don't look like this. Well, you know, newsflash, but, you know, the bad guys are totally operating in that gap, you know, in things that don't totally look like war, and challenges to security, international security, human security, national security also operate in that gap. And it gets back to not just what the military thinks is their role, but also, again, back to the civilians that are in this community being educated enough about the nature of conflict and the capabilities of the military to be able to say and identify when they think the military isn't preparing for the right kinds of war, right? And so there's definitely requirements on both sides, I think, to come together to understand the nature of conflict, as H.R. McMaster would say, the enduring nature of war, but also the changing nature of warfare. And to ensure that we're planning for the right things, that when military advice comes across the river, that it's for something that the civilians want. I've got a problem to solve. You know, what can you do besides, you know, this very narrowly scoped thing? And I think that it's not always very popular to say, but for $600 billion, the American taxpayers probably should get more than just a shock and awe approach. And I think that the military has seen that, and I think they're trying to adapt. But I think that that's going to continue to be a struggle because of the way in which we continue to raise generations of military to be very competent at the very technical parts of their job, and then to conflate that with strategic approach to warfare.
I mean, I guess I don't know that I see it as a civil military problem, right? I mean, the general officers who I deal with day to day have spent years through personal experience, through academic study, both at the nation's leading civilian institutions as well as at the war colleges and at Leavenworth, thinking through questions about what are the threats to the national interest? How do you scope them? How do you structure a force to deal with them? So they bring with it a lifetime of expertise that very few civilian leaders, no matter how much you can come in from the Hill like I do, we are relative dilettantes. And as a result, that puts us at a legitimate disadvantage in dealing with these questions. And yes, there could be friction, but it's because you have people who have thought a lot about it. Not necessarily correctly always, but they've spent a lot of time thinking about it. And again, it doesn't become a civil military issue in the sense of, I have no doubt, and I have never seen a single occasion when the Army didn't say, we will do whatever you tell us to do, right? We don't really know what you want us to do, senior leader. But if you tell me what you want me to do, I will tell you personally over beers that I agree or disagree with it. But if you tell me, I will execute exactly what you want me to do. But to tell them what to do, you have to understand the Byzantine processes of the U.S. Army. I mean, you know these better than anyone, right? I mean, you cannot come in and run the Army without an intimate understanding of the PPBE process, of the ASPG, the APPG, the APGM, the APG, you know, the J-Struck, the R-Struck.
He'll explain all these later. Questions and answers.
You don't need to know these, right. But there are 40 or 50, no kidding, processes either that are internal to the Army or are about the interaction of the Army with the with OSD that you really have to understand well. And who has that kind of expertise? Well, you know, the people who have the expertise are folks who've had 3 or 4 joint assignments, and then they worked on the R staff, and then they went out into the COCOMs and worked as well. I mean, that's a formidable group of people who really know what they're doing, much more so than a guy like me, a congressman who comes in, and sure, I could have, you know, kind of cocktail views about whether we should do X or Y in China or Syria. But manipulating the bureaucracy is not something that even the most learned congressman has. Very few civilians have. And so, to me, the major question is, if we wanted to think through and rejigger the Army to be, say, completely Kohn-centric, if that was the vision for the U.S. Army, that's going to be stability ops and counterinsurgency, I have no doubt the Army would do exactly that. There'd be people who disagree with it and would argue against it in their private time or perhaps try to dissuade you. But if the Secretary said, this is the future of the Army, I want us to move out, and the R-Struck is going to reflect this, I'm going to get into the force file, I'm going to rejigger every BCT to look just like this, and people will be like, got it. Well, we'll execute on that plan, right? It takes a lot of confidence to do that, and only confidence requires a certain technical understanding of how the Army operates that very, very few civilian leaders ever have.
I think I'd add my own views on this, which would be that given that there is probably an increasing gap between the experience, military background, numbers of veterans that are both on the Hill but also in senior civilian positions that oversee the military perhaps has a bigger role in the future now to understand and to help, you know, educate and provide options to these civilian leaders that are comprehensible to normal people. Don't include any of those acronyms that are in plain English. And that really reflect that depth of knowledge and expertise the military has. And my argument would be that generals have a responsibility to give advice and to understand and participate in the strategy formulation process because their role doesn't end at the battlefield. That the Army perhaps tends to take this outlook that our job is to win battles and therefore that wins wars, which is of course not the case. And that particularly during my era in the Army became so focused on campaign planning and the operational art and winning battles that they lost sight of the ultimate objective, arguably, which was to deliver on the policy objectives, whatever those might be. So I think as fewer and fewer members of the civilian leadership have that background or have been exposed to that or served in that military, that the uniform military is going to have to take a bigger role, not in owning that space, but in understanding there is that gap and that they have to educate and support and partner with, you know, their civilian leadership in many ways and making sure those end game objectives are talked about because we don't always do that terribly well.
Can I
sure,
add
Janine.
something to that? I'm intrigued by your alphabet soup about the bureaucracy because I often feel that it's true that especially at the political level, the appointees that come in, the ones that don't have respect for the bureaucracy and the way it works are never going to get anything done, right? You've got to be able to make that thing sing. Like Michelle Flournoy, I think, has a black belt in how the Pentagon works, and I was lucky enough to learn from her and serve under her, but that's not necessarily the norm. However, there is, I would say the people that understand that process the best are actually the civilians all across the Pentagon, because by the time a uniformed military person shows up in the Pentagon, you know, they've spent their first 10 to 15 years learning to fly the plane, you know, doing the technical things that I did, that you all did. They're completely shocked by the Pentagon as well. And so I think that you have, you know, both sides at the senior level going, oh, wow, how do we make this work? And you've got this, like, army of civilians that are showing everybody the way on the bureaucratic side. So I think there's, you know, it's not necessarily a civil military issue at that top level.
I would just like to add that if the processes are so complex and so Byzantine that they get in the way of effective civil-military relations, well, then maybe the Army and the other services have to review their processes. And I remember in 2006 and 7 when I was at Carlisle, and I ran into a famous Army general named Richard Treffry. And Treffry had this wall of how the Army does its business. And I mean, it wasn't a Rube Goldberg machine because it wasn't understandable. It was huge. It was the length of that wall over there. And so, you know, civil-military relations are at the center of all military activity. It all rolls downhill from there. And if the military hasn't adjusted to being able to communicate, or with its processes cannot provide in a reasonable amount of time or an effective amount of time options, as you say, or even more time it requires to squeeze those down to one option, which is not helpful for civil-military relations, I think that needs to be reviewed.
Let's shift and talk a bit about the separateness of today's military. I think that's an issue that, as I look at, I came in the military right after Vietnam. That was a military was just leaving a draft era that had been in place since World War II in most respects. And the draft era military had connections in every community in America. The reason there were 100,000 protesters on the Mall during the Vietnam War was not because there was, in my view, entirely a great upset over Vietnam, but all those people had some connection to going to Vietnam, knowing people who were in Vietnam, being exposed to the risk of that foreign policy decision. There weren't 100,000 protesters out during the wars of the last 13 years, or anything close to it, anywhere in the country. So a very, very different dynamic. Today's military, as Janine noted, is actually pulled out of about 27% of the population that's even qualified to compete to enter the military, because the other 75% are disqualified due to lack of education, lack of health, lack of the proper record that doesn't include criminal offenses, and a variety of other disqualifying defects. So 2/3, 3/4 of our young people can't even begin to walk in the door of a recruiting station. Moreover, the military, as all of you know, is based in what I call the world's most exclusive gated communities in usually fairly remote parts of the country, where they have lots of training land, but where they have all their own facilities, their own daycare, their own gymnasiums, their own health care, their own schools, their own department stores, their own playgrounds, and their own cemeteries. And it's a force in many ways that when it comes back from these wars, it comes out of the headlines, will come back to these cantonments and be very apart from the American people. Is that a good thing? Can we continue that? Is that just the nature of the all-volunteer force? Because it certainly lends itself to being a very separate culture from the rest of the United States.
Well, it's always been that way in peacetime. You know, we actually waged half the Cold War with this all-volunteer force, so it's been increasingly of this type, and it's much larger and much more influential than a peacetime force ever before 1940. All of what you describe is functional. It's effective. Is it a good thing? Well, it's more representative than it was during the 19th century, but it is what it is. I think we don't take steps particularly to ameliorate this gap and this separateness. And if I could be a shop steward for the Union for a moment, Janine's absolutely right. I mean, well, how are we educating our civilian population about things military, which are so important to our country? And the Army could spend, here I should tug on Mr. Carson's jacket, and you know, for a few $1 million, you could support more military history, military sociology, all sorts of courses in elite and non-elite American higher education. And those courses are popular. And to nest them just in the ROTC department where they might not get even credit is ridiculous because students want to take them, but they want to take them from professors. They don't want to take them necessarily from Army officers, ex-officers who are contractors, actually, in ROTC. So, and there are other things we could be doing to ameliorate this. It is very different, Dave. I would say that. I mean, from the 1970s, you had a broken Army, you had anger in the country, lowest esteem in history, in some history, recent history for the Army, but a Cold War to still worry about, tremendous still racial problems in the Army and the other services, tremendous trying to integrate women in the 70s. It was tough, and so you entered, and the fact that you stayed, hats off to you and your generation to stay for a profession when you started. When I was at Rutgers in the early 70s, officers could not walk across Fort Dix unaccompanied because they'd be assaulted by their people, uniformed people, and that's a different, we have a much more professional, technical, competent, loyal, thoughtful, educated force today than we've had in the last 20 years that we've had probably in our history.
And yet there's still an expectation that we reflect the American people, that we're part of the culture, that we're, in a sense, citizens first. Military people were citizens first, and then soldiers or Marines. But if you look at the demographics, going back to ROTC alone, where we recruit people from, tends to not be on the coast where all the population is, where the cultures are very different, but in the middle of the country, in the south and in the west. We have most of our ROTC detachments not where there's millions of Americans that represent some of those coastal cultures in New York City or a place like that, but in Alabama, where it's a lot cheaper to have an ROTC detachment and scholarships cost a lot less. So inevitably we see a very skewed demographic between what comes into the military, what nature of that citizenry comes in, and that also contributes to a separate culture. And I think there's potentially some issues on that over time. So as we look at that, Janine, any thoughts? You know, the Air Force has a different demographic clearly than the Army does in this regard, but do you have worries about that?
Yeah, I have a few worries. I mean, I do think that, you know, compared to where we've been in the past, I mean, I'm also not just a veteran myself, but I'm a Navy brat. So I grew up, I mean, I was probably 32 years old before I was, you know, thrust into the cold waters of the American healthcare system, right?
The expensive and cold waters.
Yeah, you know, Cobra, that's like $600 a month, and you're supposed to be for people that don't have jobs. I didn't really understand it. But so part of this is about there's military people that, especially in the last 10 years, where Congress has continued to pile on to compensation in a way that I never knew when I was either a brat or as a military officer. That they are separate also from the political issues that the American public is worried about. So the American public is having trouble with housing, with education, and with health care. Those are three things that military people really don't have to worry about. And in fact, in the last 10 years, I didn't really know this until a couple days ago, but you know, you get housing assistance and when you're in the military, and it used to be you'd get like 80% of what they thought the rate would be where you are. And that makes sense because they're making military people move around all the time. You can't invest in a home. It's really kind of a bummer. Maybe you can live on base or you can get this housing allowance. The Congress has changed that to 100% now. And also, I forget what year it was in the last 10 years, but just before the big mortgage problem, they also indexed it to, you know, the housing prices. So when you look at what's chunking up the budget of compensation, housing is this huge thing. It's grown like this because it got tethered to the crazy housing market. And it went to 100% instead of 80%. And so once you ratchet these things up, you can't ratchet them back down. So there's a proposal in Congress to make it so that they only get 96% instead of 100%. And the military's up in arms about it because once you give them a, you can't bring it back. But it used to be 80, so what the norms are. And I think that in healthcare, we could talk all day about healthcare, but I mean, the healthcare system that the military has, despite some of the real problems in the VA, is pretty amazing. I mean, I'm grateful that my own father is still on the healthcare system and he can go to Bethesda and get the red carpet treatment. That's fabulous. But that's not the norm for American society. So when you have political debates about these big issues, the military is kind of apart from that, and I think that's a dilemma. And then the other thing I'll say is, we are totally in agreement, we should start our own university, but about civilians really needing to understand the military more and that it starts in the education system. Over Veterans Day weekend, I was invited back to my alma mater, which is the University of Colorado in Boulder, to be a keynote speaker for their Veterans Day event, which they've never had before, because why would Boulder have a Veterans Day event? They had a 2-week event. And you know what motivated it? When I asked the woman who started the whole thing, she was like a patron of the arts, and donor to the university. It wasn't just a university thing, it was a whole community thing. She got invited to Carlisle, Pennsylvania for a week in like 2005 or 6, or during the height of the Iraq War. Some sort of Army outreach program to, find groovy people around the country and teach them about the military, and it totally paid off. So we should be doing more of that kind of thing as well.
Mr. Secretary, any thoughts on demographics and the challenges? I know the Army probably is most affected by this with the largest end strength out there and having to recruit across active Guard and Reserve across the entire nation.
I guess I'm more sanguine about all these issues than either Janine or Dick are. And let me just pick up a couple of threads. We are at Hood, Bragg, and JBLM, not because of any reason other than they have huge training ranges, and the core competency of the U.S. Army is combined arms maneuver. It's what separates us from all of the militaries in the world, and you have to have a huge back 40 to do that, and you can't do it right in Northern Virginia. You have to do it in Central Texas or North Carolina or places like Oklahoma, where you have Fort Sill, where I'm from. And we have all of these benefits because it's hard to recruit. The thing that it's actually still moving to me, every day I'm in the U.S. Army. Every person I meet who is a major or below in the officer corps joined doing one thing. They're going to be sent to Iraq or Afghanistan multiple times in all likelihood. And I have met many officers now who are, senior field grade, some of the general officers, 5, 6, 7 years, right? They have been overseas. 5, 6, 7 years. That's unbelievable. Unprecedented in American history, right? The kind of commitment we've asked. And so yes, we put a Baskin-Robbins on the fob, and yes, we have beautiful housing, right? The people who know the U.S. Army will appreciate the housing we give our soldiers today, right, is inestimably better than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Because it's hard to recruit people into an all-volunteer force when you say, you know what, as soon as you finish training, right, you're going to rock into Iraq or Afghanistan. You're going to do it for a long time, and it's going to be dangerous, and you can come back and be forever changed, right? And some of your friends won't come back at all. And so, right, we give benefits to recruit them. And yes, if you go to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which I know well, right, yes, there are beautiful facilities, there's nice benefits, right? It's because we have to recruit young people who have many options in this world to join the U.S. Army. And that's a hard thing to do, and it ties in perhaps to what I would support that Professor Kohn mentioned, which is the Army supporting more military history programs. Right? But it's not the Army's job to be supporting military history programs. It's the universities, right, to meet a demand for this extraordinarily important discipline. That we don't says something about the larger culture, about what's valued, right? I don't doubt students like it, but we need to do more of it. And if the Army has to subsidize it, that would be a necessary but not ideal outcome for this. I mean, the world has changed, right? And this, I think, is what I would end with. In the last 100 years, really coming out of World War I, right, war as an instrument of statecraft has been delegitimized. Before World War I, it was just the way you settled border disputes, right? War was what you did. Today, right, it's a fundamentally illegitimate activity that you engage in for defensive purposes. In the U.S. do, right, or preventative purposes if we have to, a necessary evil, not just another tool, right, that you use to settle a dispute with your neighbor. And that has changed everything. So, the Army all the services are an amazing place. We give lots of benefits to recruit people in. It's extraordinarily expensive to do so. It is a subset of our population, but it was ever thus. And if they're better, well, I'm kind of grateful for it. And if they, there were problems in civil-military relations, it's because the civilians probably need to pull up their game, right? To study the questions of history and of strategy, but also to run this bureaucracy. Because we created it, right? This is all McNamara's shadow, these bureaucratic schemes, right? We created it, but we don't have the expertise, and it's up to us to bring our game.
I want to turn now to your questions here in the audience, and I will go ahead and single out folks once you raise your hand. Please, when you stand up and are recognized, identify who you are, where you're from, and pose whatever comment you have in the form of a question with a question mark at the end, and be brief so we can get several questions in before we have to adjourn. Right here in the front row. Yep, there you go.
Thank you, sir. John Evans from the Brookings Institution. I'm one of the Chief's senior fellows there. I want to go a little bit away from what you discussed for a moment, if you'll entertain it, and that is, as we talk about this civil-military relationship, do you believe, any of the panelists can jump on this, that we have seen this expansion in the executive branch, and not just the Obama administration, we've seen it in the Bush administration as well, with some of the other instruments that are out there, and specifically the National Security Council, where they have become operationalized and therefore kind of reduced or denigrated the ability of our senior military and civilian leaders to help us craft the foreign policy and the larger grand strategy that we need to be able to go objectively, have objective metrics out there to design our military against and apply our military towards.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
So let me take a stab at that, and I think maybe recast it a bit to, in this, to your point, John, I think is that there's a question today that you see some reporting on whether the White House has become too powerful as an operational entity in the world of foreign policy and national security overseas, whether they're involved in crafting relatively low-level strategies for Iraq or Syria, and that they're, if I understand your question correctly, displacing the roles of the senior military leaders in the Pentagon and even the senior civilian leadership in the Pentagon to give that advice and offer those strategies to the president. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay.
Well, I would say that, the centralizing trend of the White House really began certainly with the Nixon administration and probably before. It is a product of, I think, many factors, including the distrust of White Houses for the political process and for the other branches of government, and the politicization of so much national security activity. I think it's also the case that Democrats come into office with the old trope of being weak on national security, so they perhaps have a little bit less trust than the Republicans, though it's hard to find someone who had less trust in the military than Donald Rumsfeld. And so you see these things kind of come and go. I don't know, my observations as an outsider are more that it's not that they are operationalizing it, it's that they're taking all decision making away from the departments. They're not running operations like in the Reagan administration in Central America, but they are, I suppose you could say, gumming up the works, because hard to get a decision out of them, too many people asking too many things, and it have to be coordinated and so on, and so it just creates a certain kind of sludge at the top of the government.
I think this is an interesting question, and I think historically you do see ebbs and flows, but I also think there's this conundrum, right? Because if you read military doctrine, which I do because I'm kind of a nerd like that, it lays down in the planning process and in other things the expectations of what sort of guidance the military is going to receive from their civilian leadership in order to do the plan, in order to come back with best military advice, however that process, that gonculator of a process works. And when you read it, you think, you know, it's kind of unrealistic, some of it, to think that the civilians who are not the technical experts when it comes to war are going to provide upfront guidance for things like how many resources, you know, they're willing to provide, how long a duration they want this operation to go, you know, what the end state is when there's these mushy, complex problems out there. You have to be sort of divinely inspired to be able to issue that kind of guidance up front without asking a couple questions. And so then you get, you know, this expertise gap. The civilians that are supposed to provide guidance that don't have the military knowledge for some of the questions. So then they start digging in deeper, and then they get accused of getting in the weeds. So you have to have a certain level of expertise in order to get the guidance, but you know, you're also not supposed to be in the weeds. And so you have definitely a chicken and egg problem here. And I think that the more complex the problem set is, when you talk about things like ISIS, the more you're going to have that. And I actually feel like at the end of the day, that sort of frustrating back and forth dialogue may actually be, up to a point, required. Because how else are you going to get that back and forth? It cannot be as linear as the doctrine says that it is. I think that's a little bit of misrepresentation for how we're going to solve these problems in a civil-military dialogue together.
Okay, next question. Right here.
Thank you. Kevin Green, a former naval person. This issue of the relationship between military members and the American people really is interesting. And when you consider the public commentary with regard to that relationship, one often sees the support our troops and the yellow ribbon business and all of that. And on the other hand, a somewhat complicated response or reaction to former very senior military officers making public commentary on security issues or, God forbid, participating in the political process. In your view, Dr. Kohn, what is the proper role for people who have served and are no longer in uniform with regard to the questions of national security and their expertise?
I think their proper role can be anything legal that they wish, except for flag officers. Retired flag officers have a special role and I think position in American society. One said to me, we're the closest thing to an American earl, you know. We rise by merit, and of course there's also the denigration that comes with it, right? You know, the brass. But I think that for general officers and admirals to be endorsing people is really dangerous and difficult for the people on active duty. It politicizes the military. It tells the active duty and reserves that it's okay to be partisan. It tells the American people that the military is partisan. But it's particularly true when the 4-stars, or retired 4-stars, start endorsing presidential candidates. But as for sharing their military expertise, you know, let's put aside the fact that they may be getting, they may be flacking for their service or for contractors or for people and warping their judgment in public. There's been some reporting on that. Let's just say they're trying to inform the American people and use their expertise either on writing things or writing a memoir, writing a book, or on television or on blogs and so forth. I think that's fine as long as there's some ground rules, some parameters. You know, you don't attack an administration and its policy and its execution if you served in it at a high level. Okay? I don't think that's proper. I don't think it'd be proper in business or, you know, you don't surrender, when you hang up your suit, you don't surrender your professionalism. When I retired from the University of North Carolina, I didn't start endorsing plagiarism. I mean, it just didn't occur to me. You know, it's a different profession, but, you know, you're still a professional. And high-level people speak for the profession, the more prominent they are, the more they are representative of the profession, whether they like it or not. And most of them seem to me like it because they don't give up their first name, which is General or Admiral. And so as a result, you know, they have certain responsibilities to the profession they served and to the country they served for a lifetime.
We have time for one more question, I think, here. Let me see. About right here.
Hi, I'm Dr. Julie Pahachik from the Institute for Defense Analysis. It was raised earlier that within the Pentagon, we struggle a lot with the complexity of the bureaucracy. And I'm wondering to what extent overregulation has contributed to that problem and what might be done about it in our present political environment.
Overregulation contributing to the development and expansion of bureaucracy.
Let me make an initial stab at that. Probably the acquisition world, you can see that overregulation having a negative impact, and some of the reforms have said to lift all of that. That's hard to do, but perhaps that's the one area of the Pentagon. Right in the planning, programming, and budgeting, you know, where we have this kind of Soviet-style apparatus that governs us. I mean, I don't know that there's an alternative. It's persisted through the most conservative administrations, the most liberal of administrations. The nature of the beast is such, right, that it kind of has to work that way. And to be more agile is to introduce risk into the process. There's also, you know, let me make even more a different point than that. I often think to myself, like, how would I redesign the Pentagon if I were Bob McNamara and this was kind of still virgin territory of sorts, right? And it's an interesting question and a great parlor game. But now there's, for lack of a better term, a path dependency in how the Pentagon operates, right? I would love to rip out the acquisition process and the PPE process, but so many other processes have been built around to it. Whole institutions have accreted to it, right? That you can't just do that. I mean, it would destroy the entire Pentagon. It'd be, you know, it would be a revolutionary act that would set the Pentagon back, you know, for years as we tried to recover from it, perhaps ultimately ending up in some better state, but it'd be a risk that one really can't take. So I don't know if it's overregulation. It's just an attempt to manage this unbelievable institution that, right, spends $500 to $600 billion a year, more than that, if you do different kind of accounting for it. That's having to plan for 5 years at a minimum, sometimes 20 years, trying to synchronize across lots of disparate cultures and to take account of risk in the future with a mission for which failure is not acceptable. So I don't know whether it's overregulation, whether then just the way it almost has to be, and to reform it again runs into this path dependency problem that makes it almost a parlor game to talk about how you would change it.
You know, when we were in the Pentagon, we used to call it the gonculator. You know, that it's just this big giant machine that there's, and what I think is there's part of the issue is this faith we have in sort of the scientific process that says if we put the right inputs in and then we crank it around and we do these war games and boom, the perfect force structure will come out. Right. There's more art than science, and so we're sort of conflicted between whether we want this very scientific process that spits out some perfect thing, whether we want a ironically democratic process where every stakeholder has their view, or whether we want guidance from the top. So what we have is this system that does all of the above and allows people to inject it at different points in order to push the agenda in their direction. So, I mean, I kind of think we could come off of, and if you don't, you know, if you actually have an interest and you don't like what's happening, you can call for another war game and say, you know, and try to say that it, you know, we need another scientific answer to the perfect question. So I think that we need to get back a little bit more to the art of it and the leadership of it, so that we can kind of shrink the gonculator a bit.
Dick, any thoughts?
I'll leave this one alone.
No, well, it is fascinating in the lengthy discussion we've had this morning that's gone across a number of topics, how important bureaucracy in a sense has been to all of those. And so I think one of my observations just would be that we need to, and Secretary Carson, in my observation, does this quite well in the Pentagon, challenge that bureaucracy and making sure the outcomes are in the direction we desire and not simply the results of being in a process that we can in some ways no longer control. So getting at the basic assumptions, and this gets into everything from where we recruit people from the United States to the nature of the connection between this all-volunteer force and our society. Those require creative thinkers at the top. You've got a number of them here in the panel here this morning, so please join me in a round of applause for a great panel.